All right, and we're starting today at the Renaissance, which historians still debate exactly when the Renaissance kind of begins in Europe, which exact decade or which exact year, and when exactly it ended. So there's so much debate around those kind of timelines that I just put kind of circa 1300 to about 1500 is when it starts to kind of peter out. So we'll get started talking mostly about northern Italy with the Renaissance and its political and economic developments, because they're very crucial to the rise of all the artistic movements and whatnot that the Renaissance are generally known for. And we haven't really talked much about northern Italy since the fall of the Roman Empire because it was chaotic. The so-called Middle Ages, from about 400 or 500 up until about 1300, are politically chaotic. And Italy is not nearly as prosperous as it had been under the Roman Empire. So about 800 years or so of great instability and what we call economic contraction, economic collapse. Because the former governing system, the Roman Empire, is basically eviscerated. Let's see. Italy, especially northern Italy, starts to recover its economic growth starting in about the 1200s and the early 1300s. And many historians argue the reason for that is that there's growing economic prosperity in Western Europe, what is today England and France. People start moving around again. They start traveling a little bit more, at least wealthy people. And they start taking some of that wealth, like investor companies in places like England and France and even northern Central Europe, what is today Germany. They start wanting to move from Western Europe and get down toward Anatolia to get traders into the old Persian Empire and eventually along the Silk Road or the Spice Road or whatever the textbook calls it, depending on the textbook you read. It's all the same road. Eventually get all the way to China. And these voyages, these overland trade routes, it can take you years to get that far. So these trading companies that often start off in Western Europe, they have to travel with a lot of resources, a lot of money, because they're going to be buying food to feed themselves and clothes and supplies for their voyage. And they also want to take a whole lot of money with them because whenever they get to Persia or India or China, they want to buy up as much stuff from those areas as possible. So they're investors that pull together a bunch of capital, a bunch of money, and their plan is to get to some other part of the world where they can buy goods from those areas very cheaply because they're common, and bring those goods back to Europe itself where they are rare, because what happens to the price of something when it becomes rare? It goes up. Supply and demand, basically. So you take your money, go to a place where the supply is large, where there's a lot of that stuff, and you can buy it cheap, bring it to another part of the world where that stuff is rare, supply is low, so the price goes up. And some families start making huge amounts of money off these kind of investments. This becomes important for Italy because, especially from today's England and France and even Iberia, Spain, a lot of these trading families travel through Europe and they go through Italy, especially northern Italy. And for those that are kind of traveling along the coastline, basically, they start to stop in Italy, basically, and resupply. It's a resupply point. So as they travel through Italy, they're buying up a whole lot of food, they're buying up clothes, they're buying up wagon wheels, all kinds of stuff to try to get to wherever their final destination is. And as they stay in Italy for a while, they have to buy a hotel room, they have to go to restaurants and feed themselves, they have to buy clothes, and they're contributing to Italy's economic growth. Does that make sense? And Italian companies start selling a lot more goods, which means they want to make more goods, and so what do? hire more workers. So the northern, especially northern Italy, these cities start to go into this economic boom period in the 1300s. And it's almost like a travel-based economy. It's what we today call a kind of tourist-based economy. Have you ever been to countries where a lot of their economic prosperity is based on other people traveling in and staying there for a while for vacation or something like that? Does that make sense? But northern Italy at this point is not united. It's fragmented. This is a simplified map, but there are about 100 or so different governments in northern Italy, and they often break down to the city-state kind of level, as we talked about when we were talking about Mesopotamia and Greece. And even when we talked about early Rome, Italy is tough to unify politically because it's kind of split geographically by these mountain ranges. And there's a lot of just kind of social dedication more to the city that you're from than any kind of unified idea of like Italianness. So many of the most important and powerful, we've seen this map before, but a lot of these cities become even more powerful than before. And especially Venice and Florence will be two of the gigantic powers of northern Italy. And they'll fight each other. They'll fight each other for land and resources. So these Italian cities start growing because, just like today, people go where the jobs are. The populations of any of these cities is as large as any other city in Europe at this point. So Paris, London, Constantinople would still probably be the biggest out of all the European cities. But these Italian cities, each of them has a population equal to any other city except for maybe Constantinople. And because their economies are growing much faster than any other part of Europe, this becomes the economic center of Europe. A city like Florence or Venice will have such a large economy with such a large tax base that the city of Venice will be able to get as much tax revenue as the country of England or France. So they're powerhouses, and they're going through rapid growth. And just like we've talked about before, when almost any government in world history, when they start to expand their economy, they get more tax revenue. A lot of them start to spend that money on military hardware, building up armies, supplying troops, and going out and conquering lands and establishing empires. So the military power of the city of Florence or Venice or Naples or Milan or Pisa, one of those cities will be just as militarily powerful as England. Does that make sense? And that's why you see them fighting against each other almost constantly once they go into this prosperity. They try to conquer each other's lands to get more countryside, get more farmland to feed their populations. And they're city-states, and much like we talked about with ancient Greece. Is that clear? Questions about that at all? Nope. Okay. These cities are basically all monarchies, or they're ruled by powerful, rich families. Pretty much all of them. I think it was Venice claimed to be a republic that had some kind of voting going on. People would choose their leaders, but it's mostly dominated by the richest families. So they would call themselves governors or emperors or something like that, but they're usually what we would think of today as mayors. They're the executive branch of the city-level government. But they often control areas beyond their city limits. They control the countryside around it to get the farmland to feed their growing populations, their growing economies. So maybe you have one family on a throne, but there are other competing families within a city that also want to get to the throne themselves, or they want to be involved in advising the kings and making government decisions and whatnot. So each of these cities could have several different families that are basically at political warfare against each other. They try to knock each other out of power, and they're like political parties, basically. Just like we talked about with ancient Rome. Patronage, does that sound familiar? So each of these cities could have maybe 10 or 12 major important families. And sometimes they kill each other. Some of these families get involved in long-term feuds where, like, the family leaders have to travel around with bodyguards to avoid being murdered. So some historians point at this as a kind of further development of a mafia-type system, where they're controlling economic growth, they're controlling certain companies, sometimes illegally. And if they're in government, they're often taking bribes from these very wealthy families to, lower a certain family or a certain company's tax rate or something like that, or go invade a certain place so that company can get the resources they want to grow their business. Sound familiar? Yeah. And this is when these families, literally, sometimes they run into each other on the street. They'll start fights and kill each other in the streets. So if you ever read or seen a movie, the Romeo and Juliet story, Shakespeare, I can't remember which city it's based in.
Vienna.
It's in Vienna? Okay. It's one of the northern Italian cities, and what he describes was really happening. Generations would inherit these vendettas, these kind of political enemies from other families, and even though they never really met each other in person, they might be taught from a young age that the other family is evil, and they, killed your uncle or something like that when you were growing up, and they run into each other in the public. They sometimes fight to the death. So it's that violent. And sometimes if they run into each other, they start a fight. Sometimes it just doesn't stop with them. Sometimes that grows into a riot within the city that the government has difficulty controlling. So the government has to have like a special police force just to keep law and order. And if a fight between these two families starts a kind of larger problem for the city, the government might try to jail the people who started fighting in the first place. Right? They're killing people, they're breaking the law. And most of these places have laws against murder and rape and theft and all those things. But what happens if the king or the governor or the mayor or whoever of a certain city is from one family that's involved in the fighting? Is he going to jail his own family members and file charges against them and have them punished?
No.
No. So a lot of times these city-level governments are very biased, just like political parties today. If their own members are breaking the law, they often look the other way. But if a member from another party breaks the law, they really go after them viciously. Does that make sense? So in a lot of these cities, a lot of times, even in violent actions, the law is not enforced because of this favoritism. Family or clan-based favoritism. And this really destroys the kind of equality of people. I mean, that's what patronage is. It's getting invested in a system and trying to gain favoritism. Does that make sense? So one major problem for a lot of these cities is just a lack of general law and order. The law is not being enforced equally and objectively throughout the whole population. Some people are getting away with all kinds of crazy things just because they have friends or family members in the government. And just like you see, say, today in the United States, some people don't like that very much. They get pissed off that there's so much bias and favoritism within government. And they demand change. And sometimes they take radical steps for change. And every once in a while, when a certain city's leadership was really obviously corrupt and biased and just not, enforcing the law equally, a lot of times the public will demand that those governors leave office, and they invite what they call a podesta, which means a guy who's not from this city. Find an outsider from some other place, bring him into the government, put him in charge, because that will eliminate the bias. Does that make sense? So when some of these governments get so corrupt, they basically say, trash can the whole system, bring in an outsider, have him fix the mess. And that's what the Podesta was supposed to do. They would often get a kind of term of office of like 3 months or 6 months or 2 years or whatever the deal is, to basically set the government right again, to make it objective, so it enforces the law amongst everybody equally, eliminate the bias. So a Podesta could be invited into a city and given really almost absolute power to govern the place with a term limit. And he has control of the city's army, the police force, runs all the investigations. But what's a possible problem with that? Yeah, a lot of times they want to stay in power beyond their term limit. It's hard to bring someone in sometimes and say, you're basically going to be dictator of this place for 6 months or 2 years or whatever the term is. Give them control of the army and the secret police and the investigators. And even after that term expires, that person could often say, well, we haven't fixed the problem yet. I have to stay in office for longer to set things back the way they should be. And if the population complains, what often happens?
Bring another one.
Well, they might want to bring in another one, but you got this guy in charge who has control of the army and all the kind of powers of the state, the government. Might just throw people in jail for publicly complaining what he's doing. Does that make sense? So some of these Podestas, they become basically the new kings of the city. And then they start making, oftentimes, the same old political deals with the wealthy families to get support. So bringing in an outsider and giving them absolute power to fix the mess, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And there's some famous Podestas who go into a city and they, basically try to fix it as much as they can, and then they actually do leave office when their term expires and they go back home. And they're celebrated as heroes who actually did what they were going to say they were going to do. Right? They were honest. So there's stories and books and songs and all kinds of stuff written about those guys, but a lot of these other Podestas, they're in it for their own power. They don't want to go home. So the Podesta kind of risk was a big risk to take. Does that make sense? So, questions about any of these? Nope. Moving on. Okay. And another giant reality of these cities is that they're hugely unequal economically. Basically, the companies, and especially the banks, this is one big part of Italian cities, it's the bankers who get mostly rich off of this stuff. Because they're giving loans to start companies, to buy land, to do whatever people are taking loans for. And they figure out how to start using interest rates, which is technically illegal in Christianity. Christians that give loans with interest rates attached, going right to the text. The Bible says that they're basically going to hell and there's no way they could possibly get out of it because they're using people, poor people that need a loan to do something. You're taking advantage of them if you attach interest rates to that loan. Does that make sense? So a lot of Christians for 1,000 years have been giving loans but with no interest rates attached. They just want the principal paid back. And it's some of these northern Italian banking families that figure out how to get around that rule. They basically collect interest rates without calling it interest. They just call it something else. And the most famous family for doing that is called the Medici. I think they're in Florence, if I remember. Or no, in Venice. I think it was Venice, if I remember right. But basically, much like you see in some parts of the world today, the Italian Renaissance is often families who already had companies that were making money off their investments. They often get very much richer, and the average farmers and the average workers just kind of stay stagnant. Sound familiar? The rich get richer and the poor stay poor, basically. And it's largely those companies that are connected to those families who can get political favors like lower taxes or more resources, or a monopoly right for a certain company to be the only company allowed to sell certain goods in the market. So this kind of economic inequality is driving a lot of these problems also. So, like many other instances in human history, politics and economics and warfare, these are all interconnected. All right. So that's one of the uglier sides of the Renaissance. And a lot of textbooks don't really talk about that very much. They want to focus on like the artistic movements and all the new thinking and whatnot. That's mostly the rich families doing that. You know, the average workers and the average farmers out there, they just didn't have access. They had no opportunity, or very limited opportunity. All right. All right. Here's a kind of closer map of Italy, or at least a simplified map of Italy throughout the Renaissance period. And you can see, just by looking at the map, a lot of this kind of geographic and political split happens in the northern areas, because that's where the most prosperous cities are. And southern Italy experiences economic growth, but nothing near the level that's going on in the north. And that's still very true today. It's northern Italian cities that usually have most of the prosperity in what is today unified Italy. And southern Italy is often seen as kind of more rural, agricultural, and kind of economically older, more backward. But there is no unified Italy at this point. It's split up into 30 or so different major powers, and they're constantly at each other's throats. Wars within northern Italy are pretty much constant. They build up huge armies to fight each other. You know, a city that has a total population of 50,000, if they can build up an army of 20 or 30,000, that's pretty extraordinary. How can they build such a large army out of such a small population? Any ideas? What's their tactic?
Slave.
Not really slaves, but close. Yeah, mercenaries. They don't just make armies out of their own people. They buy soldiers from other areas that are only fighting for a paycheck. And that's one of the giant advantages of many of these northern cities. They have growing economies. They have a lot of tax revenue. They have a lot of money to spend. So the mercenaries think it's great because they're constantly employed, constantly fighting wars, and there's a lot of bidders for their labor, for their work. There's a lot of employers out there. So if you go into the job market and you fill out 50 applications for jobs, and say you get 10 or 12 offers for a job, you get to choose which one you want. Which one do you usually take? You can be honest. Which one do you take? Yeah, whoever pays you most. Sometimes without even considering what the job is. Am I actually going to enjoy this? Who cares? I'm going to make more money doing this one. And mercenaries behave like that, especially in the Italian Renaissance. Some of them change sides in the middle of a war because the other side suddenly offers them more money, which makes the governments ever more desperate to raise more money. So they increase their tax rates, but they also start borrowing huge amounts from banks. So a lot of these cities go into debt to fight each other, and sometimes catastrophic debt. So it's financial warfare they're also waging against each other. eventually they, after 150 years of fighting, give or take, they come up with a treaty system that they call the Treaty of Lodi, which basically says that each of these cities is powerful and no one should be allowed to become more powerful than many of the rest. It's basically a balance of power argument. Just keep them all about equal, therefore no one will feel confident in attacking all the rest. Does it make sense? All right. That's what we call kind of balance of power theory in international relations. And the treaty held for a while until one of them broke it. If I remember right, is I think it was Florence and maybe Genoa got together and formed an alliance to attack Milan. And Milan felt threatened, so they signed up the Papal States, which is basically here around Rome, this purple blob in the middle, to attack its enemies from behind. And the enemies got paranoid, and they asked France for help. And then the other side got paranoid and asked some of the German princes for help. So a general warfare breaks out in the late 1400s. It starts off with just a couple cities, but as they sign up more and more allies, even from outside Italy, it becomes a European-wide war that brings in a whole bunch of German kingdoms, and especially France and the Papal States, and eventually I think Naples also too. And that war goes on for 30 some odd years. So it's massively destructive. And the last really horrible thing that happened that basically scared everybody, they agreed to stop fighting, the city of Rome is attacked and conquered, and parts of it burned. So all these Italian cities have really bad memories of what that leads to, and they kind of quickly agree to stop fighting each other to avoid a full-scale, just catastrophic collapse like the collapse of the Roman Empire. So Rome was attacked in 1527, and most historians use that event as the end of the war, and a lot of other historians use that date, 1527, as the general end of the Renaissance. And Europe goes into another phase. But again, some historians disagree with that, and they want to end the Renaissance at some other point with some other event. It really depends on which historian you talk to, or which book you read, or which documentary you watch. It's a constant argument. All right, so does that all make sense? That's some general kind of political background to the Renaissance. A lot of people are more interested in the more artistic and intellectual kind of side of it. There are also two books that come out that have two kind of radically different interpretations of politics. And one is by a guy that lives in northern Italy and is basically works as an advisor to a bunch of these different governments. And his book is called The Prince. And you can see it comes out in the early 1500s. And his book is basically a book of advice to kings, to princes, guys running governments. And if you read it, it's just, this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. And his interpretations are often viewed as pretty brutal. If you conquer a foreign place, you should immediately wipe out the opposing royal family, kill them all, to wipe out any leftover attempt to rise up against you. And he says that sometimes a government leader has to be brutal against his own people, because that's what keeps people in line. You keep your population afraid of you, that if they speak out too much against you, that they'll be jailed and tortured and all kinds of horrible things. And that keeps the people quiet. Does that make sense? He says you don't want to go too far in torturing people for like mundane little things. You don't want to torture someone to death in public because they ran a stop sign or something. That's just too far, and the people will start to hate you. Machiavelli basically says You want the people to fear you, but not hate you. Because if they hate you, then they will rise up. Right? So his name and his book are often associated with theories of dictatorship and what is often viewed today as like very brutal governments. So he's often seen Machiavellianism is often described as like this underhanded, conniving government that's looking to stay in power by really any means necessary. Doesn't care too much about its people. It's mostly interested in retaining power for itself. There's another book that comes out of England by Thomas More. This is like the exact opposite interpretation. Utopia is like this guy's book that describes this mythical land where the government's really good. They're not tyrants. They're not dictators. And he says there's basically no money and no private property. So there's no reason for greed. Everyone shares equally, and everyone has the exact same amount of food to eat every day. So there's no rich and no poor, so there's no reason for kind of dividing society. And he says that society is very happy. So Thomas More presented that idea as like often interpreted as the exact opposite of Machiavelli, where people like their government so much, if they go to war, they're willing to fight to defend it. All right? So two radically different interpretations of what government should be or could be that come, at least in the beginning, right out of the Renaissance. So that starts us off more on kind of intellectual ideas about how they're framing this and talking about politics at this point, or two of the major writers at least. But again, a lot of historians like to talk about the Renaissance based more in kind of artistic movements and changes and improvisations, all kinds of things. But a lot of the motivation to do new forms of art is based in economics. You have a lot of families in northern Italy that are unbelievably rich. Like the Medici family is reportedly the wealthiest family in all of human history relative to the rest of their society. They have a greater percentage of the money floating around in their society than virtually any other family in any society throughout human history. So they have an unbelievable amount of money to spend. And there's other families that are close to that level, extremely wealthy, and they don't just compete with each other in politics, trying to knock each other out of government. They also compete with each other socially. So they throw big parties and they, show off their new great clothes and their gorgeous big houses. So they're in social competition with each other, and that kind of extends out into the arts. So a family will pay an artist, like an innovative artist with a new way of painting or a new idea in art, to do paintings of their family in the new style. Because they want to take that new idea of art, and they're going to hang it on their wall, and they're going to throw a big party and show it off to the other wealthy families. So that motivates artists to come up with new ways of doing portraits and paintings and songs and sculptures and all kinds of things. Does that make sense? Because if you have a new great idea, suddenly there's a whole lot of very, very rich people out there that want to buy your painting. And that pushes the development of kind of artistic fads that start going faster and faster and faster. And when one rich family buys a painting that has the new idea, and everyone goes to that party and says, "Ooh, this is such a greatest thing," then the other families want to buy paintings from that artist or pay other artists to do similar kinds of paintings to kind of keep up with that development. Does that make sense? And I think you still even see that today. I mean, I have a family member who has a lot of money, so he goes out and buys like the newest giant HD TV, right? And throws a big party. All family members come over and say, "Oh, what a great TV! I have to have that for myself." And then they go out and try to buy something like that to keep up with that development, right? I think it's also happening with cell phones. I know a lot of people go get a new phone like every 3 months or something, and I often ask them, well, what does this phone do that you just paid like $400 for that your old phone didn't? A lot of times it's really not much. It's just getting a new phone, right? Keeping up with the newest trend or the newest thing. And people always laugh at me because I have a cell phone from 10 years ago and a lot of people don't even know how to use it. But I do, and it rings, so it's a phone. And a lot of these families become so obsessive with having access to the newest development, the newest idea. They don't just buy paintings or sculptures anymore or songs. They buy the person doing it. They go and basically offer a lifetime contract to some of these artists, especially the ones that are getting more famous for their new ideas, their innovations. If you've come up with a new way of painting that becomes really popular, you might have one of these companies or one of these families coming to you and say, we want to buy not just this painting, but every single painting you do for the rest of your life. And this would be like today, someone comes out with a new movie that hits big and a studio comes to them and says, we'll put you under a lifetime contract. We want you to do movies for us for the next 20 years and we'll pay you $1 billion. And what does that screenwriter or that director quickly say? Sold. I'll take it. And who knows if the rest of their films are going to be the same or as good or who knows what. But they'll take that lifetime contract. And a lot of these families, they don't just give them the lifetime contract and just let them stay in their own studio and just keep working. They often bring the artist into their own house. They give them a studio in the family's mansion. So he lives on the family grounds and eats the family's food and goes to the family parties. And the family buys him clothes and resources and all kinds of stuff, and he's getting paid a salary. Does that make sense? But everything he produces from that point forward, he doesn't own. The family owns it. Does that make sense? So some of these artists, and sometimes they even intermarry into the family. They take on these contracts and they'll marry like the rich guy's daughter or something like that. So they literally become members of the family sometimes. So that's the level of corruption that kind of gets going. And of course, that this level of patronizing the arts, buying up artists, inspires other artists out there who are still like independent workers, inspires them to try to come up with the newest idea in music or the newest idea in sculpture or whatever. Because they want to get one of those nice lifetime contracts because that one innovation could set them up for life. And some of them work really hard at trying to come up with a new idea. They try all kinds of new stuff. And that's one thing about the Renaissance. It's like this explosion of experimentation in all of the arts, and even in philosophy and poetry and all kinds of things. So, questions about all that stuff? And it's largely because the artists are competing against each other for those contracts. So it's a marketplace kind of motivation. Moving on from here, all good? All right. Okay, and even the Renaissance will develop a new kind of religious philosophy. The older religious philosophy, the kind of like conservative Christianity by that point, was based off this idea of original sin. And we've talked about that in here or no? No? Original sin is the biblical idea, the story that Adam and Eve were the first people. And you know what happens with them? They bite into the apple. You've heard of this? Okay. And God judges them sinful. And the idea is that since they were the first two people, and we're all descendants from them, that every person born is born in sin. They're imbued with sin. That's the word that Christians often use at this time. So you inherit this original sin from Adam and Eve. And so they basically say that unless you do something or a system of things really well in your life to get God on your side, to get God to like you, to gain God's favor, you're going to hell after you die. So you're born with the kind of likelihood of going to hell because you're already sinful from birth. And you have to do all these actions, often within the church system, to get God's favor to let you into heaven. So if you don't go to church, you don't do all this stuff, then you're automatically going to hell by default, right from birth. And especially in northern Italy, just like with big cities today, the religious people often call them dens of sin, right? Because cities that's where crazy stuff happens. That's where you can go drinking. That's where the prostitutes are. That's where all the money is. That's where the corruption is. That's where the bribery is. That's where the murder is, right? You've heard of this before? And a lot of Christians, even at this time during the Renaissance, a lot of them say in order to escape going to hell, you have to leave human society. You have to get out of that horrible city, because otherwise you're going to be too tempted. So a lot of Christian leaders in the years before the Renaissance, they actively leave the cities, and a lot of them go out to like monasteries, or they go out in the woods or something, and they live by themselves, almost as hermits, to avoid being sinful, so they can get into heaven. They withdraw from society. They say society is just too evil, too corrupted. They don't want anything to do with it. Does that make sense? As a kind of logical system, one thing leading to the next. All right, this is a kind of popular idea within Christianity. And then the Renaissance comes along and flips a lot of that interpretation. The Renaissance, a lot of their philosophers and a lot of their thinkers and writers and whatnot, even their Christian writers, they go back to the Bible and they read the early parts of the Bible that says that God made the whole creation and declared it good, and that God made humans in His own image. So they start interpreting that saying that we're not born with original sin. We're born pure, and we have opportunity. So we don't have to feel weighed down by that kind of guilt. And they look at the other early passages and say that God gave humans the mission to go out and perfect the world, to make it better, and to procreate and whatnot, fill the world with people. And so the Renaissance places an emphasis on a different part of the book, basically, different lines in the book. So the Renaissance philosophers are much more optimistic for people, for humans, for individuals, and for human society. So the Renaissance thinkers start arguing that this idea of going out perfecting the world, that implies two things. You have to take action to make the place better, and you have to be an independent thinker. You have to come up with new ideas to improve it. Because improving something really is built on criticizing what's already going on and figuring out how to stop that and do something better, right? How to improve something. That takes a creativity and critical thought. So a lot of these Renaissance philosophers start rejecting this kind of conservative Christianity that is based in like guilt and sin and all as a starting point, and they talk much more about being actively involved in society. So a lot of the Renaissance leaders will stay in the cities. And their argument is, if these cities are so imbued with sin and corruption, it's our job as people to make it better, to improve it, to break that corruption and make government better and make society better and help people be better. So they stay in the cities because that's where most of the population is. That's where the people are who need to be helped. Or the people are who these philosophers want to help is probably a better way of putting it. So it's a radically different interpretation of the Bible and of what Christianity means in general. And I personally get the feeling you can still see those strands within Christianity, right? You still see a lot of groups that are more focused on the sin part and the guilt part and trying to, find a way to get God's favor. And there's other groups that actively talk about, going out and taking more action to improve society in general. Maybe I'm the only one who sees that. Do you see that out there? All right. Two different kind of strands. Another area is literature, but this guy Petrarch, he's important for several reasons. Probably the most important one is that he starts writing books. He's a literary figure. He's kind of like a novelist today. But he puts out this argument that the ancient time, especially to these Europeans, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, Petrarch said that was like the height of human development, the height of European reading and writing and math and science and architecture and all things kind of artistic and good and stable, basically. He said that was the best time, so he calls it the classical time, the golden age of European history, up to the time he lived in the 1300s. And then he said that when the Roman Empire collapsed, when it fell apart, that starts off a forgettable, unimportant, intellectually and artistically at least, unimportant Middle Age, where nothing really happened for a long time. That a lot of Europeans, they forget how to read and write, even the rich ones. And there's no new great artistic developments. Really, there's not even a whole lot of new books published. There's not a lot of new paintings being done. Architecture kind of falls by the wayside. A lot of the Roman era technology and architecture just becomes forgotten. The buildings might still be there, but these middle-aged Europeans, hundreds of years later, all those writings and books about how to build that stuff had all been burned or lost or damaged or something, to the point that Europeans don't know how to build that stuff anymore. They don't know how to build giant aqueducts. So the knowledge has been lost and has to be kind of rediscovered. So he says the time that he lives in, the 1300s, is what he calls the rebirth, the new beginning. Where basically the Europeans are going back and rediscovering those ancient texts from Greece and Rome and trying to figure out how to do that stuff again. Not just to build the big buildings, but trying to figure out how they did those great sculptures and their system for writing poetry and all kinds of things. So that's what Renaissance literally means. It means rebirth. And Petrarch is saying we want to get going again and at least study the ancient stuff, the classical stuff, and hopefully use that as a jumping off point to go into a new wave of development and kind of technological innovation and all kinds of things. So he talks about the Renaissance as like the savior of humanity, basically. It's going to pull people out of the mud and dirt and muck of the Middle Ages and rebuild stability and the kind of glory and grandeur of those classical systems. Yeah?
Oh, so he was a philosopher?
He's a philosopher and a novelist and a writer and a poet and all kinds of things. And this is his big, at least, contribution to philosophy. Just splitting history up into these three different eras, at least European history. Which, by this point, that's really all Europeans pretty much care about is their own history. And you can see this reflected in a lot of even art that is created during the Renaissance. A lot of it depicts Roman or Greek scholars or philosophers or artists on some level, because the Renaissance really comes to worship a lot of them. Like, these were the smartest guys. These are the greatest thinkers that have ever lived in Europe. And this one by Raphael is really just the center of a much larger painting, and it's depicting several Greek philosophers. I think this is Aristotle on the left and Plato on the right, if I remember right. Socrates is down here. Can't really to see it, but he had a bottle of wine around here somewhere, a glass of wine, which is supposed to be the poison he's trying to kill himself. But that's how you know it's Socrates. But all the rest of them were all philosophers. They didn't live at the same time. But this is a statement from the Renaissance that Greek philosophy, especially in Athens, is like a university that the Renaissance scholars are going back to and looking at these guys as their teachers. All right. And Raphael is one of the kind of giant artists of the whole Renaissance. And there's many, many of them out there. Today they're famous for being fighting turtles, if you remember that at all. Da Vinci is another one of the big ones. I like this image because Da Vinci was what we today call a Renaissance man. He studied all these different kinds of things. He studied human anatomy, he studied art, he studied military technology, he studied all kinds of stuff. And this is one of his drawings of the study of the human body and how musculature works, and how the body works, how it functions basically. So I like this image for humanism because humanism becomes one of the big Renaissance philosophies, which basically says that you're not born with knowledge. You learn things as you go. And that means that as you grow up and go through life, you have an opportunity to learn things. And those who really strive and to take that opportunity to learn as much as they possibly can throughout life, this philosophy says that basically you create yourself and your own life by what path you choose, or what paths you choose. Do you choose to be a corrupt person or a criminal or something to just steal and get as much money as you possibly can? Or do you choose a path that's kind of more honorable and study something that'll actually help other people? Those are choices that all of us to some extent make. And the Renaissance idea is that you choose your own path, but you should not just choose one path, that you should study many different things. Because if you only study one topic, you can become an expert in that topic, but you won't know anything else about the rest of the world. You'll be what we today call over-specialized. Like a person that studies European history since the 1600s but gets questions on the 1300s can't answer them, right? Because you get this level of specialization driven into you to a point where you're just kind of ignorant about the rest of it. Not to mention anything about astronomy or math or biology or anything related to technology. Does that make sense? So the Renaissance philosophers say that even if you want to go in and study history, you should also try your hand at painting. Study that for a while. Try some architecture. Try some technology. Try biology for a while. Study many different things so you can become knowledgeable on many different subjects, and that's what makes you a really well-rounded person. So they call it developing all of the possibilities of all of your talents as much as possible. And Da Vinci is also representative of that because he worked as a painter, as what we would today call like a medical researcher, and he worked in military technology. He made inventions for warfare that he sold to different Italian governments. There's another strand of humanism that really attacked the kind of the dialectic, the logical constructions of scholasticism we talked about last time. Humanists often argue that some people can just pick up a philosophy book and read it and understand it. And then they can argue with each other. But for the rest of us, that's really pretty boring to just listen to two people argue with each other logically about facts and what they should be, how they should be interpreted and what they mean and all that. Um, most of us aren't really interested in that stuff. So to get the rest of us kind of invested in that, the humanists argue that basically you should take those logical arguments and you should put them into music, more popular music that people enjoy. So they might like the song, but they'll still hear the message. They'll still hear the idea in the lyrics. Does that make sense? Or take a just kernel of a philosophy and put it into a movie that a lot of people will watch. Because by watching a movie that they just consider entertainment, they'll get that idea and maybe start thinking about it. Does it make sense? The humanists basically argue that all those people obsessed with perfect logic, they're basically robots. There's no emotion in those arguments. In fact, they try to keep emotion out of it as much as they can. And the humanists basically call them logic machines. They're computers, they're calculators, that's all they are. And they may come up with good facts and good research and all those kinds of things, but the rest of us, we can't listen to them talk. It's just too boring. We're not interested. So if you take their findings and put them into movies or music or something more popular that most people have access to, that most people enjoy, that will kind of help those ideas develop much more because you'll reach a bigger audience. So yeah, that's up here at the bottom. They consider pure logic, the dialectic, to be kind of just robotic, just stale. And you might get that if you just pick up a textbook and start reading, right? Does it make sense? That's why I give you guys the film analysis assignment. You can watch the movie, but you still have to, the assignment is to look for evidence to prove something about the movie. So you're still involved in a logical construction, but not in the way you're just picking up textbooks and comparing them to each other. Which some of us can find exciting, but probably not all of us. No? Okay. Let's see. So Petrarch, his big book is called the Decameron. Petrarch really gets into humanism. And the Decameron is an interesting book because, remember, he's also living during the plague. The plague hits in the 1340s in Europe. That's right in the middle of his lifetime. So the book, the Decameron, takes place during the plague. And it's basically a bunch of kind of wealthier people. They leave their city because the plague is there. They don't want to get sick and die. So a bunch of them get together. They leave the city. They go out to the countryside. And they basically lock themselves up in this big house. And they're not going to let anyone else in to avoid getting the plague. And the Decameron is basically these people inside the house get kind of bored after a couple of days. So they start telling stories to entertain themselves. And it appears that Petrarch's point with this book is to show that each person telling a story has an individual psychology. There's different kinds of people in the room, and each one of them tells a story that a person with their type would tell. Does it make sense? So it's often compared to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is very similar, where, if you ever read it, it's this group of people going on pilgrimage, so they're traveling together. And to alleviate the boredom of travel, they start telling stories. And there's like a knight, there's a nun, there's like people of all these diverse backgrounds. And when you analyze the individual stories, they're often based in the kind of personality of the person telling the story. And the argument seems to be that each of us individually have our own backgrounds, our own psychology, that makes us really different from each other. Very individual. And that the choices we make in life and the paths we take influence our kind of development in life. So by the time you get to be an adult, you've had such a special set of circumstances and motivations and kind of variables that are impacting you ever since early childhood, that you are very much a completely individual person. You're not exactly like anyone else. We are all snowflakes. We're all special. All right? So historians and, well, let's call it literary historians who read this stuff and try to figure out, what was their intent, what it was about, why is it significant for coming out in this time, often associate these stories with like individual psychology and individual emotion and motivations. Does that make sense? Questions about that at all? Nope. Okay. Moving on. For sculpture, kind of go through several different kinds of art real quick. Medieval sculptors had made statues to fit in the buildings that house them. So if a building is kind of like real tall and narrow inside, with like high beams to hold up the ceiling, they would often make really tall statues, and even the lines of the statue, how the figure stood, would try to be like made in proportion to fit into how that space is constructed. So a lot of medieval statues are just kind of standing up straight. They're not really flowing or moving or anything like that. And the Renaissance, a lot of those artists start to trash that idea and try to make sculptures to be much more naturalistic. So a lot of them are going back to kind of ancient Greek sculpture as an inspiration that we've seen before, with all the muscles in the human body moving and connected. And you can see this in this one by Michelangelo, which is supposed to be someone holding Jesus' body after crucifixion. And you can see it's very flowing. It looks very human. It looks like this stuff is actually alive and moving, all the way down to the dress is kind of rumpled. It looks like it's in motion, which is very, very, very different from most medieval sculpture. Does that make sense? And it continues to amaze me that someone could carve something like this out of a giant rock to make it look like that. It's something I can't even comprehend how that is done. But not only did this person have that talent, but they worked on developing that talent throughout their whole lives. And Michelangelo is one of the most famous of the Renaissance artists, especially for sculpture. But he is also one of these artists that is under a lifetime contract. So he works for one family for almost his entire life. And he's really good at it. That's why he got the lifetime contract. Some medieval paintings. This one we've already seen of Urban II giving the sermon at Claremont to get the Crusades going. A lot of medieval painters simply painted the foreground objects. And in this one, you can see he just left the backgrounds hazy and vague, like there's not really much back there. So you can see that in both kind of panels, like these comic book type panels that depicts events happening over time. So the one on the left is Claremont, or Urban II arriving at Claremont on his horse, but you can't see anything in the background. It's just like the people in the foreground, right? And they're pretty much drawn up and down. They're not drawn to depict a whole lot of movement. And the same thing with the panel on the right, with him actually giving the sermon. He's just kind of like standing there, and they're just kind of, well, they look like they're standing there, but probably sitting. But there's nothing in the background. It's not very realistic. Does that make sense? And with these panel types of paintings, they're often intended to be read like comic book pages, where as you go through chronologically, you kind of like get the images of the story. And the Renaissance really ditches that, especially with the background thing, and tries to depict things in much more dramatic detail to get the idea of motion, things moving around, and also what's important behind the major figure. And this one's by Michelangelo on the the roof of the Sistine Chapel, and it's supposed to be God on the right, touching hands with humanity, basically empowering humanity. But you see there's angels and all kinds of stuff in the backgrounds. So there's a lot of detail, and especially when you look at the whole Sistine Chapel, that image is just way up on the roof, but the whole ceiling is covered, and all the walls are covered, and it's reportedly all done by Michelangelo. So this took several years to create. So he's the most famous artist of his time, basically. Even in his own lifetime, he's already seen as one of the greatest to live in that era. And that's why the church hired him to do this. But you can also see other paintings that are attempting, or that attempt to depict things in a kind of naturalistic type of environment with a certain amount of emotion and movement in the figures. And also extensive backgrounds to put them within their setting in much more detail. And again, you can see the clothes are flowing and rumpled, and even the ground, the rocks are depicted like they're being impacted by something. They're not just kind of flat and all one color. And this was a giant innovation, a new way of painting for the Renaissance. And a lot of these very wealthy families just floored when they start seeing stuff like this. They put this on a wall, and they start feeling like looking at this painting is like we're looking through a window. That's how natural it looks. Because it was so different from this stuff that doesn't look natural at all. You can tell just by looking at it that it's a painting, right? And let's see, and there's another one. A lot of these artists, especially once this background idea gets going, they start going into portraiture. They become professional painters of individual people for hire. And they're usually painting rich people because they're the ones who have money to pay them. So this innovation, especially the backgrounds, starts spreading far and wide. And you start getting a lot of portraits being painted of like rich people or maybe their children, often standing in front of windows to provide a background to be interested in. Because what's the fun in painting someone standing in front of a wall? It's like a waste of space. So you can see the rolling hills, the three-dimensional quality of the painting. And this is when they start getting into studying how images seem to shrink the further away you get away from them, the perspective idea. Right? So they start studying that mathematically to figure out scientifically how to portray this stuff as realistically as possible. And we get a lot of statements from people who look at these paintings, and they literally say it's like looking out of a window. And they're sometimes shocked by this, which I found interesting when the HD TVs started coming out, the high-def TVs, and that's exactly the sales pitch, right? It's like you're not looking at a TV. It's so detailed that it feels like you're actually at the place and you're just looking out a window watching the baseball game or whatever. I say some of my relatives have those TVs, and it's shocking to me because I don't even have a TV anymore. So I don't even watch TV, and I go to their place and watch it on this giant screen that is hugely detailed. It's pretty amazing. No? You never seen one of these? Yeah. They're really expensive. That also keeps me from buying one. Probably always will. Until I hit the lottery or something. I got a few million to waste. So questions about this at all? Nope. All right, and probably one of the most famous of these portraits is of the Mona Lisa by Da Vinci. So he used a three-dimensional background. That one seems pretty pessimistic. not nearly as happy and kind of countryside and flourishing-ish. I mean, this one looks like it's just devastation and burning in the background. It looks like a remnant of a giant forest fire back there. So a lot of scholars have tried to figure out, what does that mean? Did the place that she lived, was it conquered? Was it actually burned? Or is Da Vinci trying to say something about this area, that it's going into economic collapse or something? This might be the future. There's all kinds of arguments about what the background means with the Mona Lisa. And also that she seems to be smiling a little bit. And scholars and historians and art historians have interpreted that in millions of different ways. One of the more general interpretations is that she may have been secretly pregnant when he painted her portrait. And so she had a secret that she hadn't told her parents yet. So she's kind of smiling about that, getting away with it. Right?
She probably caught the fire in the back.
No? Maybe caused the fire. Who knows? But it's also kind of representative of the Renaissance, because this is a painting that Da Vinci did for hire. This was a one-off painting for this family, and they paid him to do it. And if you get into kind of studying Renaissance paintings, there's all kinds of crazy things they do. They put like secret messages in some paintings, and there's one famous, I think it's Da Vinci, did a self-portrait as an old man and reportedly tried to put an image of his younger self within it. So they start getting into all kinds of experimental, all kinds of strange stuff. All right. Let's see, what else we got here? All right, so we talked about northern Italy for a while. Just north of that is what we today basically call Germany. Back then called the Germanies, because it's split up into several hundred different tiny little kingdoms, sometimes no larger than a village or a city. And German politics are just as complex and corrupted and filled with infighting as northern Italian politics. And this is even a kind of simplified map of all the different kingdoms of the Germanies. And so yeah, they're basically like, the Germanies are basically like city-states also, conquering surrounding countryside sometimes. And there's hundreds of them. And I like this map a little bit more, because when you look at the Germanies on this map, you see all the patchwork in different colors, and a little bit stronger representation of how many there are and how many are fighting each other on a fairly constant basis. At one point in the 1300s, though, mid-1300s, a lot of the German kings get together and they form what they call the Hanseatic League. This is basically them cooperating for trade. They agreed to establish basically a league-wide navy to protect their boats as they're traveling around Europe. And the League will eventually develop a unified army to try to defend all of the Germans against foreign attacks, say from France or England or something. So even in the midst of all their infighting over their own territory, they all recognize, or a lot of them recognize, that it's better for them to, when France declares war against some of them, for all of them to get together and kick the French out, because the French might come through and try to conquer all of them at some point. So the Hanseatic League is maybe like a United Nations of Germany, basically. United Kingdoms of Germany, that kind of deal. And they're around for quite a long time, and the League's military, and it also has like a foreign trade division, basically. They try to negotiate with France and England and eventually Spain and Austria. Austria's out here, this kind of bluish blob out to the east. The League interacts with the other major powers of Europe and the northern Italian city-states. But it doesn't last. It really starts to break down by the 1500s, and the Germans go back to fighting each other pretty mercilessly. But there is some amount, or at least attempt at cooperation amongst the Germans with this league. And the Hanse basically translates as a corporation. They're cooperating with each other, at least in a foreign policy with the rest of Europe. Does that make sense? All right. Another thing that comes out of the Germanies in the mid-1400s is one inventor creates or invents the European printing press, which is basically a giant leap forward, because without the printing press, the old way of producing a book, of making physically a book, is to hire someone to literally write out by hand the words on every single page. And maybe someone else to do a couple of pictures in the book. That's how books are made. So books were extremely labor intensive before the printing press, because how long does it take for you to copy down every word from a book that's 100, 200 pages long? It can take a couple days. So the guy making that book has to sell it for enough money to support himself and his family for a couple days, right? To profit off of his labor. Therefore, books were worth a lot of money. In the European Middle Ages, books in Europe are literally worth their weight in gold. If you have a 10-pound book, it's worth 10 pounds of solid gold, because it took so long for so many writers to actually copy all that stuff down. Printing press goes much faster. It's basically you make a wood cutout or some kind of metal cutout of the letters for a page in a book, and you just dip it in ink and then slam it on a piece of paper, and you have the printed page. Does that make sense? So it could take quite a while to make enough plates for each page in a book. That could take weeks or even months. But once you have them made, you can dip them in ink and just start what we call a printing press. You just put it on a page, on a page, on a page, and now you've got several copies of that page within seconds, right? So a printing press was expensive at first to make and get production going, but once you get it going, you can make a whole lot of books much faster. And suddenly you start getting more and more books in European society. What happens to the price? Just like anything else, when you flood the market with something, what happens to the price? It goes down. Yeah. You increase the supply, that means they're not as rare anymore, so the price falls. Right? So that's what the printing press does for Europe in the mid-1400s. Other areas of the world already had the printing press. Chinese had it, the Ottomans have it, the Muslim Empire has it. So Europeans are behind in that development by hundreds of years. But at this point, you can see the literacy rate in Europe start picking up. Let's see. Yeah, we're looking on this side. The left side is the number of literate people in Europe. But since their population is growing, that's not really a good measure. We want to look at the percentage of people in Europe who know how to read, the literacy rate. So you go back to, say, the height of the Roman Empire around year 0. We're following, I think it's the green line. Yeah. So at year 0, the height of the Roman Empire, about 1% of the people in Europe know how to read and write. The wealthiest 1%, right? Does that make sense? As you go through, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, that number goes down. Then very slowly it picks a little bit back up. And by the time you get to the 12 and 1300s, with scholasticism, more schools, maybe about, well, here's 10%, here's 1. So maybe about 2 or 3% know how to read and write by the 1300s in Europe. Once you get the printing press, watch this number start going up really fast. So in the next few hundred years, now you're up to over 10%, and in our time, it's over 90%. So this scale on the right side, you go from 1 to 10 to 100, it's not really to scale. But you can still trace the numbers, and right when that printing press hits, that's when you see the numbers really take off. Does that make sense? Because more books means lower prices for books, which means more people can afford to at least have a book or two in their house and try to learn to read and write from it. Right? And what was the most popular book to have around? Yeah, the Bible. So even today it's described as the best-selling book ever, but I don't know if that's exactly accurate. But books are becoming cheaper. More people are learning to read and write. And one of the most famous books of this kind of early few decades after the printing press gets going, from Gutenberg in the Germanies, is from a German scholar named Erasmus. And he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly in the early 1500s, which he says started off as like, he's an educated guy, he has educated friends, and he wrote this little kind of argument against what is today the Catholic Church, the Pope's Church, saying basically it's full of superstition and fallacies and whatnot. And he said he just wrote this down and like passed it out amongst his friends, and they could talk about it and debate it. But his friends said they liked it so much that they told him to publish it wider to get it printed in mass numbers and sold all around Europe. So this becomes one of the giant bestsellers of the early 1500s. And a book with that message being printed in that amount and spreading far and wide throughout Europe tells us something about what Europeans felt about the Pope's Church at that point. A lot of them are disappointed in it, angry about it, and are looking to make changes. Does that make sense? And historians still do that with popular books and even popular movies today. What does the fact that all these comic book movies making so much money the past, 10, 15 years, 20 years, what does that tell us about, say, American culture at that moment? Desperately looking for some superhuman type person to save us all because we can't solve our own problems. That's one suggestion. But literary historians do that all the time with books. It says something about a society when a book sells that much so quickly. And historians now know that just a few years later, Martin Luther publishes another book that starts what we call the Reformation. The splitting of the church into a protest movement that start calling themselves Protestants after a while. And those who remain in the Pope's Church start calling themselves Catholic. So that's where the split happens. And a lot of historians point at Erasmus's book as kind of laying the groundwork, the popular argument that something's wrong and needs to be fixed. And then Martin Luther comes along with some suggestions about how to fix it. And others. But that's largely History 6. That's a modern Western civ that often starts off with the Reformation.